mode.
Welcome to today's ASIF webinar. My name is James Cameron, and on behalf of the Australian Construction Industry Forum, I'm pleased to welcome you to the ASIF webinar today, looking at how compliance and regulation is changing going into 2018 and what that means for the construction industry. Before we start, just a few housekeeping notes. Everyone is in listen-only mode. However, we invite your questions, which you can provide via the questions panel on the GoToWebinar screen, where this arrow is pointing. Today's webinar will be recorded and copies will be available after the webinar. The Australian Construction Industry Forum, or ASIF, is the meeting place for the building and construction industry in Australia. Together we seek to develop a successful, strong and sustainable construction industry in Australia, identifying cross-industry issues and negotiating policy and advocacy to encourage industry improvement and increased productivity. We are focused on creating a competitive construction and property industry that is a leader in building Australia's prosperity. ASIF members are among the most significant associations in the industry, spanning the entire asset creation process from design, cost planning, construction, building and management. Their support and insight are invaluable. ASIF exists primarily to represent and assist its members and through them the whole construction industry. ASIF is an industry not-for-profit, and support from our partners is vital to our ongoing operation. CBUS Super Fund is our principal partner. As an industry super fund, CBUS is focused on maximising retirement outcomes for members and making super hassle-free for employers. CBUS leads an exemplary group of organisations who support ASIF's work, including Cordell, Design Build Expo, Pointsbuild, who are educating us today, and Viewpoint Construction Software. Our work is only possible with their ongoing financial support, so a very big thank you to all of them. Every 6 months, ASIF publishes new forecasts for the benefit of the building and construction industry. We draw together data and expertise from across the industry on the macro and micro drivers of change that affect our work demand, our industry's need for labour and skills, what amounts of residential, non-residential and engineering construction we can expect, plus the major projects in the pipeline. Kerry Barwise and his team use ABS data, but also data from Cordell and Outlook Economics. And the forecasts of Kerry and his team are scrutinised twice by ASIF's eminent construction forecasting council prior to their launch every 6 months. We draw this together and publish it as the ASIF forecasts. These forecasts are built with a unique whole of industry approach to ensure that we have reliable, credible information upon which businesses large and small can plan their next business move. You can find out more about the ASIF forecasts on the ASIF website. Our presenter today is Michael Tomlinson. Michael is ASIF's education partner and a leader in continuing professional development, or CPD, education and training services. Michael has over 20 years experience in education and training, IT, consulting services. In 2007, he founded Pointsbuild and is responsible for the company's leadership, strategy, execution, and day-to-day management. Prior to Pointsbuild, Michael worked with Microsoft in consulting services. Pointsbuild is the leader in the delivery of professional development platforms, education and training and related services for all sectors of the building and construction industry. The company offers over 130 courses and delivers over 20,000 activities each year to more than 7,000 customers. In today's webinar, he will provide all the information you need to stay informed of the latest changes to the regulation and how to safeguard your business financially. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, James, and thanks very much to ACIF for hosting today's webinar, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear us. We have, I think, about 50 people registered to dial in, which is terrific, and it's a range of professionals from across Australia's building and construction industry and from 5 or 6 states and territories. So good morning to those that have called in from Western Australia. What I was hoping to do today was sort of give you a broad overview of compliance, what it is, what it means, and to prompt you into thinking about what is coming up and how it may affect your role or your business in its operation. And I'm really keen to foster a bit of a discussion throughout today's session. So feel free to ask questions through the chat forum. Any questions that you have that I can't answer directly, I'll take on notice and follow up within the next few days. The things I was hoping to cover in today's session was really a very quick overview of Pointsbuild, just to set the scene in terms of our background, an overview of compliance, because it's an often used word and can mean different things to different people, and some of the key 2017, 2018 compliance obligations and changes, and then looking a bit further afield in terms of the future of compliance, what it could look like, what it will mean for yourself, what it could mean for yourselves. Very quick summary about Pointsbuild. We are 10 years old, and we founded to make a difference and to make it easy for license holders, trades and building and construction industry professionals who hold some form of license or approval to operate to gain continuing professional development in a flexible manner using technology to allow them to renew their licenses to continue to operate. Professional development has been around for a long time. It's only fairly recently being adopted in the building and construction industry. As James said earlier, we have over 130 odd courses and deliver well over 20,000 courses a month, 20,000 courses a year, excuse me. And we are a registered training organisation, which gives us a recognition of quality and security and stability for yourselves. We also offer our courses and our services not just to individuals looking for professional development, but increasingly to businesses by way of a corporate CPD service that allows organisations to cater for their education and training of their staff, employees and contractors as well. The first section I want to address is around just a very quick overview of compliance, what it is, some of the historical perceptions, some of the current perceptions, and then national drivers and market drivers, if you like. So really, compliance can mean different things to different people. I guess formally a definition is really around conforming to a rule, such as a specification, policy, standard or law. There is an onus or responsibility on compliance, not just for an individual, but increasingly for organisations now to comply with relevant laws and policies. So whilst, for example, the individual might have the licence to be a builder, quite often regulatory compliance is on the company that employs that builder or the projects that that company creates. Quite often compliance in the building and construction industry is really about defining or specifying the minimum standard and requirement. That has evolved and is often interpreted to what is the least we can do to stay legal. So quite often the compliance is really about specifying the minimum requirement or standard, and that is what people are often tasked with, what they can perform to stay compliant, to then keep in business. Moving on to some of the historical perceptions, it has been viewed as a box-ticking exercise in the past. So compliance by way of, have you got the right sheets of paper in your tender application? If you ask the average licence holder, be it construction professional, trade or industry professional, there's an often held view amongst professionals that it is good for people to stay compliant and it is good for problem licensees, but clearly that's not me. And quite often there's a historical perception of, well, compliance doesn't appeal to me, doesn't affect me because I belong to a different scheme. So for example, architects in one jurisdiction might not have to think that they need to comply in other jurisdictions, but in reality they will if their work is in that jurisdiction. Moving into sort of current perceptions, increasingly compliance is seen as the hallmark of a professional industry. It is often used now as a lever for competitive advantage. So in the growth of public tendering, where construction industry organisations are increasingly contracted with government, it is often seen, a good compliance is often seen as a competitive advantage when interacting with government. It's also increasingly a policy lever by government. That can be interpreted as a useful way for the government to say no to something if you are not compliant. And although in the past compliance has been unnecessarily a cost burden, with the move to technology and technology revolutionising today's industries, especially the building and construction industry, the cost and the overhead of maintaining compliance is increasingly more of a commodity, less of a burden on terms of price. Interestingly, there was a survey last year of the building industry in Queensland that looked at ongoing training systems and a mandatory system to raise standards. And most people, over 3/4, felt that a compliance-based training system would raise standards. And that demonstrates a change in a lot of people's mindsets, moving from historical to current perceptions. There's a range of national drivers in compliance, moving from event-driven. So we look at, the obvious examples are the problems to do with cladding and non-conforming building products in Victoria in recent times, and also with Grenfell Tower in London as well. Increasingly, as there's a growing thirst for specifying products to comply, individual building products I'm referring to here. So there's national drivers in terms of specifying products. And that can feed into consumer drivers as well. So consumers like to know that their structure that is being commissioned, their construction, be it a house, be it a large construction site, is compliant. The government and all three tiers of government in Australia, local, state and federal, trying to tread a tightrope between the need to regulate and not have to deal with the consequences of poor buildings, and also be seen to regulate versus the need to reduce bureaucracy and red tape. Unfortunately, compliance is often seen as a bureaucratic and a red tape process as well. So there's a lot of political imperatives around trying to reduce red tape and ergo trying to reduce compliance until a problem arises. For example, non-conforming building products and the cladding issues we've recently seen. There's also a growth in the compliance to maintain your license to operate or your registration. That could be a company registration, it could be a company's registration to operate a certain type of construction, or even your compliance to maintain a membership to an industry association or regulatory association. Some of the market drivers that we're seeing in terms of the world of compliance is, it would be great if in the varying schemes and levels of government there was a need for compliance to be actively managed and endorsed by government regulators. There is presently a lot of confusion over what constitutes compliance. If I pay my licence fees to have my ticket to operate once a year, does that mean I'm compliant? Also, a need for providers of compliance, such as Pointsbuild, and that's just an example of an education compliance provider, a need to keep adding new activities that will stand up. Quite often, compliance providers aren't necessarily subject to regulation themselves, and we see that in the growth of the consultancy market that has sprung up in terms of regulating building or advising building and construction industries, taking guidance from advisors that aren't necessarily regulated themselves or compliant themselves, can lend construction companies into trouble as well. I'll just pause briefly there for a quick minute. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the dashboard, and I'll read out the question and provide an answer. If not, I'll proceed on. So I don't think we've got any questions at the moment, so I'll move on to the next stage of today's webinar. I really want to talk now about two or three of the key areas of compliance in a changing world. I guess the de facto primary piece of documentation that we all operate with and should be aware of is the National Construction Code. I then want to talk about some new legislation that's just being introduced, initially in Queensland, to do with non-conforming building products, and then really around plumbing and drainage and some of the changes that are coming to one of the standards in plumbing and drainage. So the National Construction Code, also known as the NCC, used to be updated annually, and just recently, last year, they've moved to a 3-year cycle. That has the effect of really slowing down the changes that the building and construction industry is seeing that the legislation and the documentation isn't taking into effect. Two areas that are changing quicker than the 3-year cycle are non-conforming building products and energy efficiency. And there's some updates to the National Construction Code coming up midway through the 3-year cycle to allow people to ensure compliance, principally to energy efficiency. And then as the national non-conforming building products legislation comes into play in states and territories, then the NCC will probably get updated again next year to reflect that. The way the NCC is currently delivered and presented over the 3 volumes with many and varied state and territory variations, does have its current setup. It's pretty confusing and is hard to read and interpret. And there is a large initiative underway by government, led by the Australian Building Codes Board, to streamline how you read and interpret the National Construction Code. One of the key changes that's happened in the last year is the National Construction Code is now online as a document. It is free to access, and you can register for it and access it through the Australian Building Codes Board website, which is abcb.gov.au. We do have a many and varied audience today, so I thought I'd just quickly give a very quick summary of where our principal document, the National Construction Code, sits. So it's a set of documents in 3 volumes that only gets formally adopted each year or every 3 years by the state and territory acts and regulations. So, for example, the New South Wales Home Building Act or the Victorian Buildings Authority regulatory acts, if you like. So it really is the go-to document or suite of documents for the building and construction industry. Increasingly, it will reference the Australian standards, which might have the exact technical specifications for things like plumbing and drainage, or setbacks for buildings within certain zones of certain types of land use and the like. For compliance to the NCC, it is rare these days to get brought into conflict or with the NCC directly. It is more likely that you will fall foul of the state and territory acts that reference the National Construction Code, if you like. I did want to make reference for some of the commonly used standards, and I should apologise up front. Some of the dates for these current standards have since been superseded. Most recently, probably AS 3500, the National Plumbing and Drainage Code. But they would really be your technical documents that the National Construction Code references to in terms of design methods, slabs and footings for construction. There are several hundred standards that the building construction industry can draw from. I've just listed probably the top 8 to 10, if you like, relevant to today's audience. Moving forward, I do want to spend some time talking about compliance and NCPP, which is the non-conforming building products. It has recently been legislated 8 weeks ago in Queensland as an early adopter, and the other states and territories are looking at the Queensland Act and will adopt their version of it over the course of the next 12 to 24 months. Formally, it is called the Non-Conforming Building Products Chain of Responsibility Amendment Act 2017. It's probably worth a quick explanation as to what is the issue with non-conforming building products and what are non-conforming building products. So there is general consensus that non-conforming building products can pose a significant risk to public health and safety. The initial Building Ministers Forum, or BMF, came about to discuss this as a result of the Tower Fire. I think it was the La Crosse Tower Fire in Melbourne in November 2014, but really more recently with the horrific acts, the horrific fire in Grenfell Tower in London in more recent times. There is a formal definition in the Act of what is a non-conforming building product, and Queensland Government at this point had defined it as something claims that it's a product or material that claims to be something that it's not, that it doesn't meet the required standards for its intended use. And I draw out the importance of the words intended use in that, because quite often materials might conform to a standard when they're tested and marketed and presented, but if they're used in a different manner, that can negate things. The other aspect of non-conforming building products is that they are marketed or supplied, for that matter, with the intention of deceiving the people who use them. The legislation and some of the key features of the non-conforming building product legislation is really about imposing an obligation of compliance. Excuse me. Sorry. Imposing an obligation of compliance. And the Queensland Government are terming this a chain of responsibility. So quite simply put, they're putting obligations on the supply chain participants to ensure that building products used in Queensland are safe and fit for their intended use. This legislation, I should point out, has only just been enacted. It is yet to be properly tested in courts. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens when, say, for argument's sake, a product that is manufactured overseas, it meets a standard, it's imported into Queensland, and it's used in what is perceived a non-conforming or non-compliant manner, how the government and the legal system of the day reacts to that. The government, specifically the Queensland Building and Construction Commission, is introducing a suite of codes of practice, and that's really to advise various communities within the building industry how this law may apply to them. They are due to come out between now and the end of this calendar year. Part of those codes of practice will include mandatory product information for each intended use. So it is really about, and the mandatory product information for each intended use is quite important. It means that product creators and manufacturers, product wholesalers, product suppliers, and product consumers will have to read and almost vouch for the fact they understand what it is that's being produced, what it is that's being sold to them, the use that they're intending for it, and was it actually used for that use. There's a raft of increased powers of inspection, evidence collecting and testing for suitability. So you might have a product that meets certain Australian standards or international standards in terms of its strength or tolerances to heat or cold or waterproofing or fire resistance or fire retardants. But if it's not used in the way for which it was intended, the legislation allows a course of action by the Queensland Government. And there can be direct rectification orders. And this can be irrespective or regardless of any building construction certificates, the state of that building, whether or not occupiers are in there or not. Just thought I'd pause there and see if there are any questions about National Construction Code or non-conforming building products. I've received a quick question about the use of Australian standards for businesses to do with their marketing their tools, marketing their products with an Australian standards logo. It is increasingly relevant to have the Australian standards logo. People do need to be careful, though, that it's not just it's much more than having the Australian made logo on a product, if you like, which is often used in consumer products. The legislation, especially the non-conforming building legislation, non-conforming building products legislation will have to expand things like your use of the Australian standards logo, if a product complies with that, to include the intended use or uses of that product. It will have value, it increasingly will have value, and it should be something that builders and construction industry professionals look for, only using products that conform to Australian standards and for the intended use. Thank you for that question. If there are no other questions, I'll move on to the next stage, which is really around...
Michael, this is James here. I just thought I'd ask, with the National Construction Code, where do you have any sort of thoughts about where are the main areas that practitioners in the industry have issues with compliance and why?
I'm presuming that people can hear James on the call, but I'll just restate James's question. James Cameron has just asked a question in terms of the key areas of the National Construction Code for where compliance has been an issue. From a technical perspective, one of the key areas has been waterproofing and use of non-conforming products and testing for water, testing products, and that's part of the key area. Part of the ways to address that is the use of the watermark certified product scheme, and the other areas specifically within the National Construction Code are the use of alternative solutions and how to validate alternative solutions, which is the composition or the combination of products to satisfy a building solution, if you like. The use and applying of the application of alternative solutions, and whether or not that can get through some form of certification or compliance process, is still in its early days in Australia, in the adoption of Australia. Thank you, James. Moving on, I wanted to spend the final section of today's presentation really around, well, the future of compliance. Is it needed? The benefits of getting it right or the risks of getting it wrong? Some of the considerations that we need to put into place for compliance, and then lastly, around compliance through education. I guess the first thing is really, it's partly reflective and partly moving on to the future, which is compliance. Is it needed? The proof of the pudding is we're still getting massive events like the Grenfell Tower disaster, things going wrong, corners being cut. Compliance is needed both from a real perspective and a perceptions perspective. Increasingly though, the compliance will move towards a prevention being better than cure approach. So rather than collecting evidence of compliance after something is built, the industry is generally moving towards, we need to make sure things are compliant before they're built. And this is where the advent of technology can come in terms of the rise of building information modelling, life cycle cost analysis, and more sophisticated technology-based tools to look at modelling. Is any structure or construction that is proposed going to be compliant with the order of the day? There is a broad logical argument that the better informed you are, the lower risk any construction will be, and the lower risk to your construction business. Defects and the rectification of defects is a large cost to the industry, and a large cost not just in terms of financial cost, but reputation and consumer perception cost. And if we are compliant and move to a world of proactive compliance earlier in the life cycle, there is every chance that that feeds through to lower defects and lower cost of any rectification. Ultimately, having compliance, we would aim for higher quality building completions and an increase in consumer confidence. And by consumers, I don't just mean the average person that takes receipt of his house that gets built. It could also be the government for civil construction, large housing blocks, major infrastructure projects, airports, roadways, and the like. And it could lead to, and it is just starting to happen in New South Wales and Queensland, the better compliant businesses, the more compliant businesses, are now seen as having lower premiums. So those that are active in managing compliance are also the ones that are getting rewarded financially for having lower premiums. There are some obvious risks of getting compliance wrong, and I can highlight 3 on the screen. Poor product selection in the use of some of the photovoltaics has led to fire risk. The asbestos removal problems in New South Wales and the ACT for previous products and loose leaf asbestos and non-compliant asbestos products, and most noticeably the first one being the Grenfell Tower and the use of product substitution in a non-conforming compliant product. I've just received a question, and I'll restate the question. Is there any research that has been done to prove the value of better compliant businesses in Australia? There is some analytics done by some of the insurance companies and some by the Queensland Building and Construction Commission in terms of the data. It's really only relatively a new industry in Australia in terms of measuring compliance and tailoring and monitoring the benefits of compliance through to construction. There are 1 or 2 studies now about the benefits of regulating and having compliant trades. Principally, there's a study to do with regulating and ensuring compliance in the plumbing trades and also the finishing trades as well. I've just received a second question, and I'll replay the question, which is, how do architects who work for building contractors respond when contractors ask their designer to certify that the products and materials specified are fit for purpose and compliant with non-conforming building product legislation? Is there a way of transferring the compliance risk to the specifier? The short answer is there's no direct way yet of transferring risk to the specifier. The way the legislation is currently worded is the architects and designers and specifiers can say, this is what we specify. It is really down to the construction company or the construction supervisor to choose if he's going to adopt those products or not. Many times, architects are sitting on the client side, not on the construction side. So they might have separate contractual arrangements too. So at the moment, there's very little that ties the architect and what is specified into the choice of non-conforming building products. That's a very good question, and it's one that we'll see what happens when the Queensland legislation gets tested by way of the government choosing to inspect and prosecute people. If there's no other questions, I'll move on. Some of the considerations now about the next generation of compliance providers, if you like, next generation of compliance, sorry. And this has come from discussions that I've had and Pointsbuild's had with a variety of government organisations to do with regulatory affairs and compliance. And there is a real need to be able to regulate compliance providers and compliance activities. And I'll give two quick examples of that. If a construction company retains external advisors to ensure compliance, there should be a way of regulating and and vouching for those external advisors. Equally, for compliance for an individual, for example, that has professional development obligations to ensure compliance activities, providers of professional development and compliance activities such as Pointsbuild should also be regulated. Pointsbuild, as a side note, is regulated in some as much as it can be in some sectors of the states and territories, not necessarily in others. There is real moves afoot to have an organisation or construction companies or in construction individuals compliance history published as a matter of public record, and linking compliance to insurance. This will go two ways. The linking of compliance to insurance will go two ways. It'll be good for the construction company bidding for work to be able to say, we've got a clean record, here's evidence of that, and we should be able to negotiate a lower insurance. And the insurance companies will then actively target companies that have good compliance. Compliance schemes need to be promoted, and increasingly compliance should be a requirement for tendering for public works. There should also be a range of discounts or incentives for good performance, and by that I mean good compliance performance. Increasingly, we are seeing compliance through education, where ignorance and not knowing of the legislation is not necessarily perceived as an option. This is very relevant for the forthcoming non-conforming building products legislation, which is coming initially in Queensland, but will be pervasive through the other states and territories within the next 12 to 24 months. I'll cite a quick example for that. If you purchase a building product and are given the product sheets for that product for its intended use in a compliant way, and choose to not use it for that way, the fact that you've been given those product sheets and choose to ignore it or ignorant of it is not necessarily perceived as an acceptable defence. The second point is really around harmonisation of compliance and CPD policy and delivery frameworks. And I do believe that we will move towards a national register of compliance-based activities, principally around education-based activities. We are increasingly less constrained by state and territory borders. You're getting companies based in Victoria tendering and winning for work in WA and Queensland and vice versa, and many companies in one state or territory moving and opening up offices and delivery in other states and territories. Compliance in one state doesn't necessarily equate to compliance in other states. So I do see that compliance will ultimately move to a harmonised way, if you like. It should actually become, with more and more education, an accepted practice, less of a perception of a box-ticking exercise, and more of an accepted practice that it's part of what we do. It's in all stages of the construction life cycle. And equally, that really brings me to my final point here, which is it should be across all trades and professions. A review of the legislation, a review of the Queensland industry before the National Building the non-conforming building product legislation came into place was done where it was felt that the builder took on too much of the compliance burden. So part of the chain of responsibility obligations is to lessen the burden on the builder and really make everyone through that supply chain accountable and responsible. I've just had another question, which is, what if a contractor is not provided with a product sheet, but it is readily available from websites and other electronic media? It's a good question. Increasingly, the short answer is they will have to acknowledge that they've been given the product sheet at some point. It might be at the point of purchase. That could be when they're buying a product in store or buying the product online or ordering it as part of a bill of materials, if you like. Might also be receipt of those materials. You'll have to accept receipt of the product sheets for those. I guess I wanted to quickly pause, and if there's any other questions.
Michael, this is James Cameron here again, and thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. You've probably got a few slides to go there, so I shouldn't thank you just yet. I was just curious to know a bit more about, you mentioned the National Register of Compliance-Based Activities. So you think that's what we'll be moving towards with the sort of either National Construction Code or something?
Yes, I do think the regulators in each state or territory will probably look to have a central source of compliance-based education or compliance-based information, rather than having to go to each state or territory's Department of Planning, Department of Licensing, Department of for building and plannings and permits, and deal with development applications at a local or possibly a state level. That there will evolve to be a central focal point for all things compliance, regardless of what type of project you're taking on and regardless of what your role is in the industry, be it an architect, an engineer, building inspector or certifier, a designer, or a site supervisor, and so forth.
Interesting. All right.
I guess I'm very conscious of time, so that's probably all I was going to cover today. If I could just summarise, there will be increasingly, I guess, a move towards proactive rather than reactive compliance, along the lines of prevention is better than cure. Education to demonstrate compliance will have a greater focus in the coming months and years. And with the advent of new technologies like building information modelling, more sophisticated design, computer-aided design tools, you'll see the introduction of almost real-time compliance as well. That was pretty much it from me. One final comment would be, feel free to, if you've got any questions as a result of today, feel free to follow up with me directly or via Moira and James at the ACIF. And I wish to thank the ACIF very much for their for the opportunity to speak to this audience this afternoon.
No, thanks for that, Michael. I just, James here again, just another question, and then that is that you said that the courts will decide with the Queensland legislation, and I guess I'm interested to know about. Can you elaborate at all about who will have responsibility for non-conforming and non-complying building products? Will almost all of the liability lie on builders? I mean, I'm
also where you said that everybody in the supply chain will be responsible and accountable.
So
I guess I'm interested to find out about that kind of apportionment of liability. Yeah.
We'll take the Queensland jurisdiction as a broad example. The role and the responsibility for site inspections, analysis and testing of if a product is conforming or not, will be with the Queensland Building and Construction. The role, and they will have a suite of inspectors and skill up a capacity for inspectors, and they may bring in subject matter experts, for example, engineers that understand stress testing of concrete or stress testing of steel beams or asbestos, for example. The role of investigations, the role of consumer complaints will still be held with the Queensland Office of Fair Trading. So, for example, if there's a problem with a product in its false advertising of a product claiming to be conformant and it is not, that is held with the Queensland Office of Fair Trading to pursue that particular product and the distributors or the manufacturers of that product. If it's pursuing a construction company, it will be held, I think at this point, with the Queensland Government Department called the Department of Housing and Public Works, and they will have investigative powers as well as the powers to initiate, I think, both civil and criminal proceedings. The criminal proceedings and the penalties are yet to be fully worked out at this point.
Right, and I've heard it commented that the Queensland legislation is linked to health and safety, and in that sense, some may say that it's quite union friendly, and it's sort of it's with that link to health and safety that it's often the issue that the main construction union in the industry uses to get on site. So
yes, there is a high. I guess there is an assumption or a direct correlation with a product that is either non-conforming or a conforming product used in a non-conforming way is used in a way that can compromise health and safety. So loose leaf asbestos is an obvious one. That poses a health and safety risk not just to the installers but to the ultimate end users of that building or premises. Applying cladding, if it's non-conforming cladding, it might not actually pose a problem to the installers from a health and safety perspective, but it poses a huge problem if it's found to be in breach to the occupiers of the building. The unions have had a large, and rightfully so, visibility of, well, things like rectification orders and the adequate and protective disposal of high-risk products like loose-fill asbestos.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you say that the unions have a legitimate interest in protecting the rights of their members and the health and safety of their members, and therefore the legislation sort of covers that angle. All right. Well,
yes.
unless there are any further questions, I can't seem to see any further questions in the question pane from the audience.
But yeah, I'd like to thank you again, Michael, for your presentation. It was, I certainly learnt a bit, and I'm sure everybody listening learnt a number of things as well. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and we look forward to you presenting for us again at some point. But we have more ASIF webinars in coming months, and to find out more and to register, please visit www.asif.com.au/webinar. And this webinar will be available up on our website, maybe not today, but definitely early next week for anybody else who missed it. Or if people listening would like to share the link with others, other colleagues or people in the industry, it'll be available up on our website early next week. So thank you again to Michael. Thank you to everybody. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your day today, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.